This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and interesting things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Dr. Ina Kubbe. Since 2015, she's been a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Political Science at Tel Aviv University in Israel. Proper disclosure, that's where I did my PhD. She wrote her dissertation at Leuphana University in Germany on corruption in Europe in comparative perspective. And she's a founding member of the Interdisciplinary Corruption Research Network. Most recently, she has co-edited a book entitled Corruption and Norms, Why Informal Rules Matter, co-edited together with Annika Engelbert. It's a collection of articles that will be published by Palgrave in 2018. Dr. Ina Kubbe, thank you for being on the show.
Hello.
We are going to be asking you today the question that I think everyone in Israel and probably frustrated citizens all around the world really want to know. This is the overarching question. Can corruption be stopped, and how?
Of course, corruption can be stopped. It's just the question how we will handle this in the future. We already achieved a lot. And we found out that at first the institutions matter. So how the institutions are constructed in the country. And we know that these are the democratic institutions that provide transparency, accountability, fairness, responsibility. But yet there are still a lot of things to do, but we achieved already a lot.
How does it come about that despite all these restrictive measures, the institutional ones, still there are some loopholes through which corruption can persist?
For example, Italy or Uganda, these countries that are completely different, but they have similar institutions concerning the fight of corruption. So they provide the institutions, but let's say Italy, there is still a lot of corruption. And we found out that there must be something in between, and these are informal norms. So this is the topic that we are writing about now, or this is the book that we published. So there is something in between, and this is culture, how we call it, or informal norms and rules.
Well, this is interesting because what you point out is that the institutions that were set up precisely to deal with corruption, such as anti-corruption agencies or ombuds people, that you explain that their effectiveness has been, quote, overrated. Why are those institutions not sufficiently effective?
Because there are always, as you already said, there are always loopholes and there are always some opportunities and possibilities that people try to get in and to misuse. We know that there is the dark side of the human being and there will always be. And we still need to find out how we can close these loopholes. And this depends already also of the actors that are operating in these institutions.
How exactly do you understand norms? You also talk about formal and informal norms. Can you elaborate on that?
So you can differentiate between formal norms or formal institutions. So this is what we see, what you can observe. So this is what the research found already a lot about these institutions. And informal institutions are these norms and values. This is a culture that people share in countries and in societies. And of course, these norms and values differ. And that's why we have this book that focuses on different countries and different societies to find out how are these values widespread in a country.
Well, this is what I want to try to understand. You have one chapter certainly that deals with the social psychological aspect of these norms. And when you talk about culture, it makes me think that you're implying that there's something sort of in the just DNA of that particular country that has normalized somehow different forms of corruption. And I guess I'm thinking particularly about the chapter by Niels Kubis, where he gives an interesting example, right? The example is that, you're stopped by a traffic cop for running a red light, and the question is whether you offer that cop a bribe or not. And the argument seems to be that there are certain cultures where that is simply more normal, and he posits that if it's more normal, the person is more likely to do it. But I have to tell you that from a lot of my experience working in post-communist countries and transitional societies, it's not so much a matter of culture as a simple transactional relationship based on survival. In other words, the cops are not paid enough. They're speaking a language that everybody understands, which is that you give me a bribe, I'll be able to support my family, you get off getting arrested, and that's the way society functions. And there's no other way to function. Is it really a matter of this cultural DNA, or is there something about where that society is politically?
It's also a different understanding of what corruption is, because the scenario that you describe is not perceived by the actors themselves as particularly corrupt.
Or it is perceived as corrupt, but there is no other way to get by.
Yeah. So at first you define corruption as the misuse of a public or entrusted position for private gain. So this is at first a problem because we don't know what is, or it differs, of course, in countries, what is misuse, what is a public position, where does it start, where does it stop, where's the boundary between private and public, and what does it mean for private gain. So this is where we already start, like let's find out how does this definition works in this country. And then we can come to the conclusion that's of course different how people perceive corruption. So this is another problem that we're still struggling with, that we can never measure corruption in a direct way. You can only see, or we always only have the perceptions of corruption. And because people are really interested in hiding corruption, nobody really wants to talk about this. So this is, at first we have the problem with the definition, then we have the problem with the different perceptions, and then we have the problem with the norms and values. Because as you said, in some countries, people really have to bribe. So this you can also call the need and the greed approach. People really need to bribe someone to get food, to get an appointment with the doctor, to report someone at the police station. And then you have countries where you can also distinguish between petty and grand corruption. So petty corruption, you bribe the police officer or the doctor, and grand corruption is also the greedy argument. What happened in politics in the end?
So it's sort of, there's a corruption of survival in societies that are transitioning and not functioning properly, but there's also corruption of personal aggrandizement, right, where people just want to get more and more and more and greedier.
Exactly, yeah.
But going back to the cultural aspect of it, if we look at, say, advanced liberal democracies where, this culture of propriety is well ingrained, how do you explain the fact that some people are corrupt and others aren't?
This depends at first at the institution. So when you want to analyze a country, you look at first, how does the institutions work? Are there loopholes? Are there opportunities? And then you go to the next level and you will have a look at the culture. So how do they behave? What is the norm in the country? Do they have to bribe? Do they bribe because it's just a norm, because everybody's doing this?
Yeah, but that's why I asked about liberal democracies, where it's clearly not the norm.
Mm-hmm. But also in some democracy, it's still the norm to bribe.
I was going to challenge this assumption, right?
Yeah.
No, but it is stigmatized. It is perceived as illegitimate, not some sort of... I mean, in the cases you described, Dalia, in post-communist countries, it is the norm because everybody does it.
Yeah.
But is it not?
Well,
you seem to make a face.
Well, there's an interesting question that arises in the book, is when corruption is not necessarily against the law, but is still essentially the same thing of people working within the law, but finding ways for public figures to get money that is to their personal benefit. And I think that what we're talking about, the question I had that relates exactly to what Gilad is saying is there sort of fiction about democracy? In other words, in a communist society or an authoritarian society, it became very transparent. Everybody's stealing from everybody, even if nothing can be done about it. But democracies tell themselves, oh, no, corruption is against our norms. And then we find out about Halliburton and Blackwater and the Trump tax bill, for that matter. So are democracies truly less corrupt than non-democratic societies, or are they just hiding it better by telling themselves, especially capitalist democracies, that we have laws against it, but actually the laws allow for the same processes to take place of people who are in public life finding ways to get rich on money that shouldn't be influencing their politics?
So democracies are less corrupt than other systems, than authoritarian system, definitely. Because, as I already said, it's because of the institutions, so they really limit the behavior of actors. So this is a fact. But of course, there are some situations, and especially in democracy, one of the form of corruption is favoritism. So this is something that's nothing new, but this is, so to say, the new form of corruption, that people give each other jobs, that everything works by a network. So there will always be corruption also in democracies, but in the end, they are less corrupt than other systems.
And how do we measure the amount of corruption in terms of which is more important, that there are fewer corruption scandals or that there may be the same amount of corruption scandals but more exposés and accountability and due process because of them?
Both is very important. So, of course, we want to limit corruption at first. So if there are fewer scandals, it's better for the country. And also we want to find more corruption scandals, or we want to punish more people who behave in a corrupt way. But this, in the end, only measures the efficiency of the judicial system. But in the end, both is very important. But what we also see in the last 25, 30 years is that the media is doing a very good job. So journalists are finding more corrupt cases. They're working in a very transparent and accountable way, and this helps us a lot in the last years.
I want to maybe try and look at it in perhaps a broader context. You mentioned the media now. The media has been weakened gravely over the past few years. And when we look at like markers of proper behavior and proper leadership, like truth-telling or perhaps not bragging about sexually assaulting women. I mean, back in the day, being, lying outright like that would have finished a politician's career, and now it seems to be going the other way. Do we see, is the rise of populism in the West in a way connected to perhaps a resurgence now or imminent of corruption? Do you see any link between these phenomena?
Yeah, there is definitely a link between corruption and populism, because this is what populist parties in the end use. So this is one of their arguments. Yeah, we are fighting corruption. We need more transparent institutions. But in the end, it's the other way around, that they just misuse this argument.
And do you see this, culture of lying as a form of corruption?
Of course, we just need to look to the US, and this is the best example how it works in the end.
What specifically about the US? I'm curious what you have in mind.
We are talking about fake news and, as you said, about lies, and that they pretend to be the honest leaders, but in the end they just use the fight against corruption as an argument to get more voters.
I'm still curious to probe this connection between democracy and corruption based on the chapter that Michael Johnston wrote. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think he's trying to argue, if I can try to paraphrase him, that corruption undermines or is antithetical to democratic norms. And it's interesting, lots of demonstrations going on in Israel today against corruption, and many of the signs that I've been seeing say corruption is eating away at our democracy. What does that actually mean?
So, the values of a democracy are in the end fairness, accountability, transparency, responsibility, and this is what the citizen also, or especially in Tel Aviv, what they demand, and this is their right, that they will get this. And you also see this trend in Europe and in other continents in the world. And when they don't get this, when they don't get transparent decision, responsible decision making, when politics take place behind closed doors, this is of course undermining the values of democracy and the rights or the things that citizens deserve.
And I think he said something about, you said fairness, but he says something about the idea that in a democracy, citizens have equal opportunity. And maybe the sense that is that corruption gives people in those positions of power the opportunity to kind of shape the opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And when someone is bribing someone, or when there is when corruption takes place, it's always a third person who has disadvantages. So a third person will suffer from this. So there are only two people involved who both benefit, but there's always a person who will suffer from this because this person doesn't have the same or the equal treatment.
But when we look at the distinction between institutional norms and cultural norms, the two affect each other. There's some sort of they're not mutually exclusive. And when you talk about accountability, that is an institutional norm at the end of the day, because, what the institutions do, the ombuds people, they reveal corruption and, in a way, put it forth to the public realm so that, the people will judge. And then when the people don't judge, and of course this is an informal norm, right? I mean, if people don't care about some politician being corrupt, and despite his flagrant corruption, they keep re-electing him time after time. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular.
No, nobody in mind.
I mean, then you end up nowhere. How do you come out of this vicious circle of informal norms affecting formal norms and vice versa.
Maybe what Gilad is saying is we just have low expectations.
No, you shouldn't.
No, okay, great,
no,
thanks.
No. We are on a good way, so to say, because the research on corruption is very on the way now. So we know that there is still a lot of to do, but especially this corruption research group or anti-corruption research group that I'm working for is doing a lot, and there is also a lot of hope because we've found out more and more. And 20 or 30 years ago, this wasn't possible because we didn't have data, for example, from Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index that gives us the possibility to assess a country, that we get an impression, also that we get into a country and do more case studies and to find out what are the mechanisms behind, how does it really work in the end.
Well, actually, since you mentioned case studies, there's some very interesting and rich case studies in the book that we can talk about. One of the most interesting ones for me was Amy Alexander's chapter where she looks at the correlation between gender equality and lower levels of corruption. Now, tell us about the causation. What is the causation of those two? Is one causing the other, or is it just they're both the result of some underlying factors?
The research on gender and corruption is quite new. So we got the first publications in 1999 or in 2000. And they show that there is a strong correlation between gender and corruption. So it shows that in countries where more women in positions, in public positions and in private companies, there is less corruption. So we wanted to find out what's the reason or what's the causal relationship behind that. And there are several arguments. So one argument is that women are at first raised by certain values and norms. So here we are back to the norms and values. So that women are more, that they are the fairer gender. That
Go girl. Go girl.
That they seem to be more honest and responsible, also because they take care of the kids, for example, for their education, of course. But then when you're looking deeper, you can say, in the end, women are not less corrupt than
are we talking about the 2/3 of white women who voted for Roy Moore in Alabama, or about the third who didn't?
Or the 61% who voted for Trump? White,
so
white uneducated women.
Women are still not in the positions. Well, they're still working on their networks, or as we call the old boy network, as it works in men's world. So women are on the way, and I'm pretty sure they will behave in similar ways. We're just working on a new publication with Swedish colleagues. And where we did some experiments also in Israel and in Germany and US, and we can see that women also bribe. The only difference is that they justify their behavior more often.
But you're saying they really just haven't had as much opportunity, and when they get the same opportunity as men, they will be just as corrupt as men.
Right.
What a charming thought.
No, and I actually understood it slightly differently. The argument about gender is that, gender equality means it is one instance of bigger fairness. And therefore, the more fairness there is, the less corruption there is. But then another very interesting case study that you explore in one of the chapters is South Africa, where corruption is rampant, even though there is this really underlying discourse that was promoted by the ANC and especially Nelson Mandela of this, we're all in this together, this, going back to fairness again. It's this notion of the rainbow nation, everyone gets an equal opportunity. We're all part of the bigger nation. Yet this huge disparity between the discourse and reality. What can you tell us about South Africa?
So South Africa is a very fragile country, of course, when you also look at the level of democracy. So they still have a lot of things to do. So here we have to start, of course, with the institutions. But when you have the democratic institutions, of course, you also have to have a look at the actors. So also the actors, of course, have to be changed. And then we are getting back to our cultural argument that corruption is so inhibited in the system that also will take a long time until you could change the norms and values of corruption in South Africa.
But I actually thought his argument, Thomas Kubbe, I think is his name, was something a little bit different, that he was kind of saying that the new South Africa was established primarily in order to achieve a more equal society between blacks and whites, but actually to empower blacks, which is a goal, but that the state and even democracy was put to the service of that goal, which sounds okay, but democracy wasn't an end in itself. I think that's kind of the formulation that he has. Would you agree with that? That it wasn't so much the democratic norms and the norms of integrity and good governance that were important as an end to themselves. And maybe that's a problem. Maybe there should have been a revolutionary phase of creating a more equal society, but then transition into saying, wait, our democracy is the real thing we have to work on now.
And then we are back to the citizens. So we really need the citizens to demonstrate, to demand their rights, to demand accountability, transparency, what we already mentioned now several times. If we don't have a strong civil society and NGOs and good media and good journalists that show what's going on in these countries, then we cannot do anything.
But maybe in that sense, South Africa is a success story. The Constitutional Court ruled against the president last year, 2 years ago, forced him to pay back the money that was found to be embezzled. I mean, maybe that's just the right combination of institutions and civil society putting the country on the right direction. Do you think South Africa is heading towards a better situation from what you know from that chapter?
Yeah, for sure. But also there is still a lot of things to do in these countries because the civil society is not so empowered as it should be for a real fight against corruption.
Yeah, I think that, the Constitutional Court being the prime example of an institution that safeguards democracy and anti-corruption. And when, the context in the societal and political context in which it operates erodes those values gradually, then, it's not much worth on its own. I think that's
and
what
this
you're
is
saying,
exactly
right?
the point where our book is jumping on that. Okay, we have the institutions and it looks very well on the paper. But in fact, we need to look what's going on in these institutions and which people are working there, which leaders are responsible.
Let's talk about your next book that you will also be co-editing. It's called Corruption and Informal Practices in the Middle East. Why did you choose to focus on that region? How is it different from the other cases that you explored in the book that we've been discussing up until now?
So after we finished this book now on corruption and norms, we realized that we don't have a lot of research on the Middle East, especially concerning norms and values and culture. Though there is still a huge research gap that we want to fulfill with the next book. And Israel is now the best example to see that.
Do you think you're going to find differences between the Israeli case and other countries of the Middle East in terms of specifically the mentality and the informal norms?
Norms and values.
For sure.
Do you have any preliminary insights you can give us?
As an antidote to our impending depression?
Okay, let's
point. It's already. I'm already depressed.
When we point on Israel is a very special, a very interesting case because Israel.
Do we always have to be special? Oh.
That Israel is in democracy in the Middle East. So you would expect, concerning the level of corruption, it should be, you can compare it with the findings of European states, for example, but this is not the case. So in the end, Israel is one of the most corrupt countries in the developed world.
Measured by what? Because in the beginning you said it's very hard to have an objective measure, or do you mean in terms of public perceptions?
We always work with perceptions.
So when you say Israel is one of the most corrupt, you mean the people perceive it as among the most corrupt?
Experts, but also citizens. So when you work with the data of Transparency International, so these are experts, but we found out that also the citizens, what the citizens perceive is correspond with the perception of the experts. So in the end, you can work with both, but it's always perception. We cannot measure corruption itself.
And in Israel, we saw former president and the former prime minister going to prison. We don't know about the fate of the current prime minister, who's also allegedly facing indictment for corruption charges, and also some of his closest associates in government. Going back to a question Dalia asked rather generally in the beginning of this conversation, but now let's focus on Israel. Does this mean that Israel is more corrupt because its top leaders have been caught engaging in corruption, or does it mean that there's just more transparency and the judicial authorities are doing their job properly, and therefore we see what we see?
I just want to point out that Ina has a very pitying look on her face if we're trying to like salvage something good out of the
because
situation.
she's been asked that question so many times in the past, I'm guessing.
It's both. Of course, we can be very happy about this, that the media is doing such a great job and that we have this data of Transparency International or all the World Bank. And of course, it shows that there is more transparency, but it also shows that there is still a lot of going on.
Does it mean that the institutional norms are functioning exceptionally well and the cultural norms are very deficient in Israel?
I wouldn't say that the institutional that the institutions work so well in Israel. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible that so many politicians behave in a corrupt way.
No. Why? But then again, they're being held accountable and they're being sent to jail.
I think that the Israelis are really tolerant towards their politicians and their leaders. And I'm very happy to see that now it's the third week that people go on the street and march, but this is only in Tel Aviv. And as you can see in the news, it's getting less. But when you compare this with other democracies, the citizens in Israel, they forgive very, very quickly.
Just a quick correction. There was apparently also a demonstration in Jerusalem, and people also come to Tel Aviv from outside. But I want to bring it back to something you said earlier about, you said, no, there's no doubt that we are getting better about tracking and exposing corruption. And, you know, it seems to me you were implying that in general, countries are getting better about addressing corruption. But I'm thinking back, you know, I happened to be watching a documentary about Watergate, and we all know what happened at the end of that. The president resigned for the first time. In the 1980s, we had an Israeli prime minister who resigned because of, you know, his wife had a little bank account in the US. And now we have a prime minister facing, you know, somehow involved in 4 different investigations. And, you know, as we've pointed out, so many different corruption scandals around him. And everybody seems to tolerate it. Not only that, he insists he's not going to resign. And he is sort of proud to say, I'm staying where I am despite
so did
huge
Nixon
accusations. For a while. But I mean,
yeah, well, we'll see what happens in, 6 months' time.
But the question is, have we developed higher tolerance for lower standards? Maybe not just in Israel, is what I'm saying.
There is a very, very nice publication of Monika Bauer. It's from the Göteborg Institute in Sweden. And she found out that you see if it's greedy or needy corruption. And in Israel, it's the case that it's greedy corruption. So the people are not really involved in this. So if they would be more involved in this, that if they have to bribe the police officer or the doctor in the hospital, they would be more motivated to fight against this. But in Israel, you don't have the petty corruption. You don't bribe the police officer on the street. You have a lot of corruption in politics and in the government. And so the people are more tolerant towards this.
Because they're not feeling it day to day.
Yeah, they don't feel it directly. They only feel it in indirect way.
Okay, so maybe people should start feeling it on a day-to-day basis and then we'll do something about it.
I wouldn't wish that on society. I mean, I think it's worth remembering, by the way, that the Tunisian Revolution, which started the Arab Spring, essentially began with a petty corruption problem.
So let's hope that we see more people next Saturday on the street.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Okay, Dr. Ina Kubbe, talking about her book, Corruption and Norms, Why Informal Rules Matter, that she co-authored with Annika Engelbert. Ina, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Toda rabba.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, Itai Shelem, our producer, and the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Rumey Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. And now we have a great opportunity for you too to help us survive. Go to our website, telavivreview.org, all in one word, Tel Aviv Review, and donate to our brand new Patreon campaign. You'll be part of our quest for learning and knowledge. Plus, you'll get all sorts of gifts and perks. And we'd like to thank already those who are supporting us. There are a few of you out there already. So thank you very much. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive. There are over 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and annoyed. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.